My son-in-law looked at me and saw nothing but a senile, harmless old woman, a burden he needed to hide away. That was his fatal mistake. He forgot that before I was 74, I spent 30 years hunting down liars as a forensic accountant. He unwittingly invited a hunter into his own backyard, and tonight, in front of everyone he tries to impress, I won't just expose his true face. I am going to make him lose everything. The rain was coming down hard against the windshield, creating a blurry gray curtain between me and the rest of the world as we pulled up to the iron gates of the estate. I sat in the back seat of the black sedan and watched the wipers struggle against the storm, while Derek hummed a tune that I did not recognize from the driver's seat. He caught my eye in the rearview mirror and flashed that bright white smile that always seemed just a little too practiced and a little too tight around the edges. He told me that we were almost there and that Clara was waiting inside with hot tea and fresh towels. I nodded and clutched my leather handbag tighter against my chest. Inside that bag was my whole life condensed into a wallet and a phone and a few faded photographs. I was 74 years old, and for the first time in 40 years, I did not have a front door key to a house that I owned. I had been a forensic accountant for 3 decades, and my job was to look at numbers that people wanted to hide. I spent my life finding the lies buried in tax returns and the secrets hidden in corporate ledgers, so I learned a long time ago that people reveal who they are not by what they say, but by what they spend. As the heavy iron gates swung open, I looked at the car we were sitting in. It was a brand new luxury SUV with custom leather seats that smelled like vanilla and money. Derek ran a non-profit organization dedicated to rehabilitating injured veterans, which was a noble cause, and one that my late husband would have supported. But as I ran my hand over the stitching on the door panel, I did the mental math. A director of a mid-sized charity with a modest donor list should be driving a 5-year-old sedan or maybe a family van, but certainly not a $90,000 import with heated seats and a sunroof. The numbers did not add up, but I kept my face smooth and impassive. We pulled up the long gravel driveway and the main house loomed out of the mist like a stone fortress. It was beautiful and terrifying. My daughter Clara came running out onto the porch under a large umbrella, waving frantically. Seeing her face softened the knot of anxiety in my stomach, because she looked so hopeful and so desperate for this arrangement to work. Derek opened my door and offered me his hand. His grip was firm but cold. He told me to watch my step because the stones were slippery. I thanked him and let him guide me up the stairs like I was made of glass. That was the game now. I had to play the part of the frail mother-in-law who needed looking after. If they knew that my mind was still as sharp as a razor blade, they might not let me get close enough to see the truth. They led me through the main house and out the back toward the guest cottage. It was a charming little building separated from the main house by a garden of rose bushes that had been stripped bare by the winter. Clara squeezed my arm and asked me if I liked it. She told me that they had painted the walls yellow just the way I liked them. I told her it was perfect and that I was very grateful. Once they left me alone to unpack, I sat on the edge of the unfamiliar bed and listened to the silence. The cottage was lovely, but it felt like a gilded cage. I unpacked my few clothes and placed a photo of my husband on the nightstand. I turned off the lights early to save electricity out of habit, even though I knew Derek was paying the bills now. I could not sleep. The mattress was too soft, and the air smelled too clean. Around 2 a.m, I got up to get a glass of water. The window of my kitchenette looked directly across the garden into the study of the main house. The lights were still on. I saw Derek pacing back and forth in front of the window. He was on the phone, and even from this distance, I could see the tension in his shoulders. I cracked my window open just an inch, hoping the wind would carry his voice. He was shouting, but trying to keep his voice down, which resulted in a harsh whisper that cut through the night air. I heard him say that the transfer had to happen tomorrow. He paused and listened to the person on the other end, and then he slammed his hand down on the desk. He said, "Do not talk to me about risks, because I am the one taking all the risks here." He said if the auditors come poking around, we are all finished, so just move the money and shut up. He hung up the phone and stood still, staring out into the dark garden. I quickly stepped back into the shadows and pressed my back against the cold wall. My heart was hammering against my ribs, not out of fear, but out of a familiar adrenaline. It was the same feeling I used to get when I found a discrepancy in a spreadsheet. Derek Mercer was not just a concerned son-in-law, and he was not just a charity director. He was a man running out of time, and he had made the mistake of inviting a hunter to live in his backyard. The morning sun filtered through the high windows of the kitchen, but it did not bring any real warmth to the room. I sat at the breakfast island with my hands wrapped around a ceramic mug of tea, watching the steam rise and curl into the air. The kitchen was a masterpiece of modern design, with marble countertops that were cold to the touch, and stainless steel appliances that hummed with a quiet and expensive efficiency. Derek was rushing around in a navy blue suit that I knew cost more than my first car. He was checking his watch every 30 seconds and tapping furiously on his phone. He kissed Clara on the cheek and told her he would be late tonight because of a meeting with the board of directors. Clara straightened his tie and looked at him with eyes full of adoration and trust. It made my chest ache to see her look at him like that, because I knew how much it would hurt when the blindfold was finally ripped away. After Derek left the house, settled into a quiet rhythm, Clara said she had to run errands in town and asked if I would be all right on my own for a few hours. I told her to go and not to worry about me because I had plenty of unpacking to do. But as soon as her car disappeared down the driveway, I did not go back to the guest cottage. I needed to see the inside of Derek's home office. I told myself I was just going to tidy up, which was a half-truth. I walked into the study, and the room smelled strongly of cedarwood and stale espresso. It was a masculine room filled with dark furniture and shelves lined with books that looked like they had never been opened. I moved slowly and deliberately, wiping dust from surfaces that were already clean, just in case there were cameras. My eyes scanned the desk. It was cluttered with papers, but mostly generic correspondence and brochures for the rehabilitation center. He was careful, but I knew from experience that arrogant men often made mistakes in the most mundane places. I looked at the heavy brass trash can next to the mahogany desk. It was empty except for a few coffee stirrers. Then I looked at the shredder in the corner. The bin was full of white confetti. I knelt down beside it, and my knees popped with a sharp pain that reminded me of my age. I ignored it. On the floor just behind the shredder cabinet, there was a single crumpled ball of paper. It must have fallen off the desk or missed the bin when he tossed it. I picked it up, and my hands trembled slightly. I smoothed the paper out on the carpet. It was a receipt from a high-end jewelry store in the city dated 3 days ago. The item was a platinum watch, and the price was $12,000. I stared at the number. $12,000 was a lot of money, but not necessarily a crime for a man who wanted to appear wealthy. But then, my eyes drifted to the payment method at the bottom of the slip. It showed the last 4 digits of the credit card used for the transaction. 4099. I closed my eyes and accessed the file cabinet in my mind. I had seen a donation request form on the kitchen counter earlier that morning, intended for potential donors to wire money. I needed to verify those numbers. I pulled myself up using the edge of the desk and walked back to the kitchen as fast as my legs would carry me. The pamphlet was still there next to the fruit bowl. I put on my reading glasses and looked at the banking details listed for the charity account. The account number ended in 4099. The air left my lungs in a sharp hiss. He was not just skimming off the top or padding his expenses. He was using the charity's operating account as his personal piggy bank. He was buying jewelry with money meant for soldiers who had lost their legs and their livelihoods. I felt a wave of nausea, but I forced it down. This was concrete. This was evidence. But a receipt alone was not enough to put him away. I needed the statements. I needed to see the pattern. Suddenly, the front door opened, and I heard the heavy thud of footsteps. My heart jumped into my throat. It was too early for Clara to be back. I quickly folded the receipt and shoved it deep into the pocket of my cardigan just as Derek walked into the kitchen. He had forgotten his briefcase. He stopped when he saw me standing there, clutching the donation pamphlet. His eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second before he put that charming mask back on. He asked me what I was doing. His voice was smooth, but there was an edge to it, like a knife wrapped in velvet. I made my hands shake a little more than they naturally did and held up the pamphlet. I told him I was just admiring the graphic design and that I was so proud of the work he was doing. I told him he was a saint. He stared at me for a long moment, searching my face for any sign of deception. I kept my expression vacant and sweet the way old ladies are supposed to look. Finally, he smiled and patted my shoulder. He said, "Thank you, Iris," and grabbed his briefcase from the counter. As he walked out the door, I realized that my palms were sweating. He suspected something. I had the first piece of the puzzle, but now I knew that the clock was ticking faster than I thought. 3 days later, the house was transformed into a stage set for wealth and benevolence. Derek was hosting a private dinner for 5 potential donors, all of whom were wealthy local business owners with guilty consciences and deep pockets. The dining room table was set with Clara's best crystal, and the smell of roasting lamb filled the hallways, masking the scent of my own anxiety. I had spent the last 2 days watching Derek. I watched how he unlocked his phone and how he always checked the hallway before entering his study. I was building a map of his habits. Tonight, however, I had to play a role. Derek had insisted I join them for dinner. He said it looked good to have family present to show that the charity was grounded in traditional values. I sat at the far end of the table wearing my best silk blouse and a string of pearls that my husband had given me for our 30th anniversary. I looked every inch the respectable matriarch, but inside my mind was racing. The guests were a mix of loud men in tight suits and their wives who wore too much jewelry. They talked about the economy and their summer homes and how difficult it was to find good help these days. Derek held court at the head of the table, pouring wine and telling stories about the veterans he had saved. He spoke with such passion that if I did not know about the watch and the bank account, I might have believed him myself. One of the guests, a man named Mr. Henderson, turned to me and asked me how I was enjoying my retirement. Before I could answer, Derek cut in. He laughed a short, dismissive sound and said that Iris was enjoying the quiet life because her memory wasn't what it used to be. He tapped his temple and winked at Mr. Henderson as if we were sharing a private joke about a toddler. He said sometimes she forgets where she is, but we take good care of her. The table went quiet for a moment, and then everyone smiled those polite, pitying smiles. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks. It was a calculated humiliation. He was discrediting me in front of witnesses so that if I ever spoke up later, no one would believe me. I decided to lean into the skid. I let my hand tremble as I reached for my water glass, and I deliberately knocked over the salt shaker. I apologized profusely and mumbled something about forgetting what day it was. Clara looked at me with such sadness that it broke my heart, but I saw Derek relax. He looked satisfied. He thought he had me handled. As the main course was cleared away, Derek stood up to make a toast. He started talking about the future of the foundation and his vision for a new wing at the rehabilitation center. All eyes were on him. He was charismatic and commanding and completely absorbed in his own performance. This was my chance. I touched my forehead and whispered to Clara that I was feeling a little faint. I asked if I could go lie down for a moment in the guest room. She offered to come with me, but I insisted she stay and entertain the guests. I told her I just needed a moment of quiet. I shuffled out of the room, moving slowly until I was out of their line of sight. As soon as I turned the corner into the hallway, I straightened my back and moved with purpose. I did not go to the guest room. I went to the study. The door was closed, but not locked. Derek had been so confident in my incompetence and so distracted by his audience that he had gotten sloppy. I slipped inside and closed the door softly behind me. The room was dark, illuminated only by the moonlight streaming through the window. I didn't dare turn on the lamp. I moved to the desk. My goal was simple. I needed to see if he kept a physical ledger. Men like Derek always kept a backup record because they didn't trust computers and they didn't trust their partners. I tried the top drawer. Locked. I tried the side drawers. Locked. I felt under the desk lip and around the back of the frame searching for a hidden key. Nothing. I could hear the muffled laughter from the dining room. I had maybe 3 minutes before Clara came to check on me. I looked around the room frantically. Where would an arrogant man hide something he wanted to keep close? My eyes landed on the bookshelf. There were rows of thick leather-bound books that looked pristine. But one book on the second shelf seemed slightly out of place. It was a copy of The Art of War. It was a cliché, but Derek was a man who lived by clichés. I pulled the book from the shelf. It was heavy. I opened it, and my heart sank. It was just a book. I flipped through the pages, and nothing fell out. I was wrong. Then I heard footsteps in the hallway. They were clicking on the hardwood floor, getting louder. I shoved the book back onto the shelf and scanned the room one last time. That was when I saw it. On the small table by the window, there was a stack of mail that had arrived that morning. I had seen Derek bring it in, but he hadn't opened it yet. The envelope on top was from a bank in the Cayman Islands. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. The handle began to turn. I didn't have time to take a picture. I didn't have time to hide. I did the only thing I could do. I collapsed into the leather armchair near the window and let my head loll back, closing my eyes and forcing my breathing to sound shallow and rhythmic. The door opened and the light from the hallway spilled in. "Mother?" Clara's voice was soft and worried. I waited a beat, then opened my eyes, slowly blinking, as if waking from a deep sleep. I looked at her and asked her what time it was. I asked her why the house was so dark. Clara sighed, a sound of relief mixed with exhaustion. She came over and took my hand. She said I had wandered into the study instead of the bedroom. She said everyone was worried about me. I let her lead me out of the room, but as we walked through the doorway, I looked back at the table. The envelope was still there. I knew where the money was going now. The Cayman Islands meant offshore accounts, which meant federal crimes. Derek was not just stealing, he was laundering. And I was going to prove it. The next morning, the air in the house was thick enough to choke on. The dinner party had been a success for Derek's wallet, but a disaster for my reputation within the household. I could feel the shift in the way Clara looked at me. It was no longer just concern. It was pity, mixed with a growing sense of burden. I knew I had to act fast. The envelope from the Cayman Islands was the key, but I couldn't get to it while Derek was in the house. And more importantly, I needed an ally. I needed Clara to see the truth before Derek completely poisoned her against me. I found Clara in the greenhouse repotting orchids. It was her sanctuary, a place where she escaped the pressure of being the perfect wife. I walked in carrying 2 cups of herbal tea. The humid air smelled of damp earth and blooming jasmine. I handed her a cup and she smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. She thanked me and went back to trimming a dead leaf. I took a deep breath. I decided to test the waters gently. I asked her how the charity finances were looking. I mentioned that I had read an article about how nonprofits were struggling in this economy, and I hoped Derek wasn't under too much stress. Clara stopped trimming. She put the shears down and turned to me. She said Derek was handling everything perfectly. She said the auditors were happy, and the donors were happy, and she didn't understand why I was suddenly so interested in business when I couldn't even remember which room I was supposed to sleep in last night. The words stung, but I pushed past them. I told her that my memory might be slipping on small things, but I knew numbers. I told her about the receipt I found. I told her about the expensive watch and the car and the late-night phone calls. I kept my voice calm and rational, trying to sound like the forensic accountant I used to be, and not the confused old woman she thought I was. Clara listened, but her face grew harder with every word. When I finished, she didn't ask to see the receipt. She didn't ask for details. Instead, she let out a long, frustrated sigh. She told me that Derek had warned her this would happen. I froze. I asked her what she meant. She said Derek told her that paranoia was a common symptom of my condition. He told her that I would start concocting stories to make myself feel useful again, to feel like I still had control. He said I would fixate on money because that was what I did for a living, and my brain was stuck in a loop. My blood ran cold. He was brilliant. He had inoculated her against the truth. By predicting my accusations, he had turned my evidence into a symptom. If I showed her the receipt now, she wouldn't see proof of theft, she would see proof of my illness. I tried to grab her hand, to make her look at me. I told her to please just listen to her instincts. I asked her if she really believed that a charity director could afford their lifestyle. I asked her if she really thought Derek was being honest with her. Clara pulled her hand away. She looked at me with tears in her eyes and told me that she loved me, but she couldn't do this. She said Derek was a good man who was working himself to death to help people, and I was trying to tear him down because I was jealous of his success or because I was sick. She said maybe it was time for me to see a specialist. The suggestion hung in the air between us. A specialist meant doctors. Doctors meant evaluations. And if Derek had his way, evaluations meant being declared incompetent and sent away to a home where I couldn't hurt him. I looked at my daughter. She was smart and kind, but she was blinded by love and manipulated by a master. I realized then that I could not save her by telling her the truth. I had to show her, and I had to do it without her knowing that I was doing it. I apologized. I lowered my head and let my shoulders slump. I told her maybe she was right. I told her I was just confused and tired, and the move had been stressful. I told her I didn't mean to upset her. Clara softened immediately. She hugged me and told me it was okay. She said we would figure it out together. But as she held me, I looked over her shoulder through the glass walls of the greenhouse. Derek was standing on the back porch of the main house watching us. He was holding a coffee mug and wearing that same tight smile. He raised his cup in a mock salute. He knew exactly what had just happened. He had won the battle for Clara's mind. I pulled away from my daughter and told her I was going to take a nap. I walked back to the guest cottage feeling the weight of my age in every step, but inside, my mind was clear and cold. Derek thought he had isolated me. He thought he had cut off my support system. But he forgot one thing. A cornered fox is the most dangerous animal in the woods. I went into my cottage, locked the door, and pulled out the burner phone I had hidden under the floorboards beneath the rug. It was time to call in a favor. I dialed a number I hadn't used in 5 years. The voice on the other end answered on the second ring. It was gruff and professional. It was Arthur, my old contact at the bank's fraud division. I told him I needed him to look into an offshore account. I told him it was off the books and personal. He asked me if I was in trouble. I looked out the window at the big house where my enemy was sleeping in the same bed as my daughter. I told him I wasn't in trouble yet, but someone was about to be. I sat huddled in the corner of my walk-in closet with my knees pulled up to my chest and the burner phone pressed tight against my ear. The smell of cedar and old wool surrounded me, providing a small comfort in the claustrophobic space. On the other end of the line, Arthur's voice was a low rumble mixed with the clicking of a keyboard. He was retired too, but he still had access to the systems if he knew which passwords to use, and Arthur always knew the passwords. I gave him the partial account number I had memorized from the pamphlet and the name of the shell company I had seen on the envelope from the Cayman Islands. There was a long silence on the line that stretched out until I thought the call had dropped. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I knew that every second I stayed on this line was a risk. Derek monitored the Wi-Fi logs of the main house, which is why I was using a prepaid cellular connection that I had bought with cash at a convenience store 2 towns over. Finally, Arthur spoke. He told me that my instincts were still good. He said that the charity account was bleeding money. It was being siphoned out in small, irregular amounts labeled as consulting fees and logistical support. The money was moving through 3 different domestic banks before vanishing overseas. He said it was a classic layering scheme designed to look like legitimate business expenses to a casual observer, but to a forensic auditor, it looked like a hemorrhage. I asked him about the Cayman connection. He told me he couldn't see the account details without a warrant, but he could see the transfers. He said that over $200,000 had moved in the last 6 months alone. That was enough to buy a lot of wheelchairs and therapy sessions for veterans. Instead, it was likely sitting in a numbered account waiting for Derek to run. Arthur warned me to be careful. He said that men who steal this kind of money are desperate men. He told me to get physical proof before I went to the police, because without hard evidence, the district attorney would not touch a high-profile charity case. I thanked him and told him to wipe the logs on his end. I ended the call and my hands were shaking. It was not just suspicion anymore. It was a fact. Derek was stealing from heroes to fund his own greed. I heard the front door of the cottage open. There was no knock, just the sound of the latch clicking and the heavy, confident footsteps of someone who felt they had the right to be there. I scrambled to pull up the loose floorboard under the shoe rack where I kept the phone. I shoved the device into the dark space and pressed the wood back into place, covering it with a pair of winter boots. The footsteps moved into the bedroom. It was Elena, the housekeeper. Derek paid her salary, which meant her loyalty belonged to him. She was a stern woman with sharp eyes who always looked at me as if I were a stain on the carpet that she couldn't quite scrub out. I grabbed a sweater from the shelf and stood up just as she pulled the closet door open. She stopped and stared at me. Her eyes darted from my face to the floor, and then to the shelf behind me. She asked me what I was doing in the closet with the lights off. Her voice was suspicious and devoid of any real warmth. I clutched the sweater to my chest and let my mouth hang open slightly. I blinked rapidly as if I was trying to process her question. I told her I was looking for my blue scarf. I told her I thought I left it in here, but I couldn't find the light switch. I made my voice sound thin and wavering. Elena looked at the light switch which was right next to my shoulder. She looked back at me with a mixture of annoyance and disbelief. She told me the switch was right there. She reached out and flipped it on, flooding the small space with harsh light. I flinched and covered my eyes. I apologized and told her that my eyes weren't what they used to be. I asked her if she had seen my blue scarf. She sighed loudly and told me that I didn't own a blue scarf. She said she had come to change the linens and that I needed to clear out so she could work. She stepped into the closet and looked around, sniffing the air as if she could smell the secrets I was hiding. I squeezed past her and walked into the bedroom. My legs felt weak. That was too close. Derek had sent her. He was using the staff to keep tabs on me to make sure the crazy old lady wasn't causing trouble. As Elena stripped the bed with aggressive snaps of the sheets, I sat in the rocking chair by the window and watched the main house. I saw Derek's car pull into the driveway. He got out and looked directly at the guest cottage. He stood there for a moment, adjusting his cuffs, staring at my window. He knew I was up to something. He just didn't know what yet. I realized then that I couldn't just wait for him to make a mistake. He was too careful, and he was accelerating his timeline. If I wanted to catch him, I had to make him reckless. I had to make him believe that I was not a threat, but a liability that needed to be removed. I needed to force his hand, and I knew exactly how to do it. The following afternoon, I walked into the main house kitchen with a specific purpose. It was 2 o'clock, which meant it was time for my beta blockers. I had a strict routine that I had followed for 10 years because at my age, a skipped dose meant palpitations and a fog that was hard to shake. I kept my pill organizer on the windowsill above the sink where the light hit the blue plastic compartments every morning. I reached out for the box, but my hand closed around empty air. I stopped and blinked. The windowsill was empty except for a small potted succulent. I looked on the counter. I looked in the drying rack. I checked the floor, thinking perhaps I had knocked it over. Nothing. A cold prickle of fear started at the base of my neck. I knew I had filled it on Sunday. I knew I had placed it right there after breakfast. I was old, but I was not careless. I began opening cupboards. My movements were calm at first, but as the minutes ticked by and the box remained missing, my breathing started to hitch. I needed that medication. My heart was already starting to flutter, a sensation like a trapped moth beating its wings against my ribs. Clara walked in carrying a basket of laundry. She stopped when she saw me pulling pans out of the lower cabinets. She asked me what on earth I was doing. I stood up too quickly and the room tilted slightly to the left. I grabbed the granite countertop to steady myself. I told her I couldn't find my pills. I told her they were on the windowsill and now they were gone. My voice rose in pitch, sounding shrill and panicked even to my own ears. Clara sighed and set the basket down. She walked over to the windowsill and looked at the empty space. She told me that I must have misplaced them. She said I had been forgetting things lately, like my glasses and my keys, so maybe I took them to the cottage and forgot. I insisted I hadn't. I told her I never took the main box to the cottage. I felt the blood rushing in my ears. I was angry and I was frightened, and the combination was making my hands shake violently. Then the back door opened and Derek walked in. He was wearing his tennis whites, looking fresh and energetic. He stopped and looked at the chaotic scene. He asked what the trouble was. Clara explained that I had lost my medication again. Note the word again. It was a word he had planted in her vocabulary. Derek frowned with exaggerated concern. He said we couldn't have that. He started looking around the kitchen, opening drawers and cabinets that I had already checked. After a moment, he opened the pantry door. He reached up to the high shelf where they kept the dog food and the extra paper towels. He pulled down my blue pill organizer. He held it up like a trophy. He asked me why I had put my heart medication next to the dog treats. I stared at him. The shelf was 5 feet high. I had arthritis in my shoulders. I couldn't have reached that shelf comfortably if I tried, and I certainly wouldn't have put my life-saving medicine in the dark next to a bag of kibble. I told him I didn't put it there. I told him he put it there. The accusation flew out of my mouth before I could stop it. It was the wrong move. Clara gasped. She looked at me with horror. She told me that was a terrible thing to say. She said Derek was just trying to help me. The room spun harder. My knees buckled. The stress and the missed dose were hitting me all at once. I felt myself falling. Derek was there in an instant. He caught me before I hit the floor. To Clara, it looked like a heroic save. He held me up, his arms strong and supportive. He called out to Clara to get a glass of water and to help me to the chair. As Clara rushed to the fridge, Derek pulled me close to his chest. His grip was tight, almost painful. He leaned his head down so his mouth was right next to my ear. His breath smelled of mint and malice. He whispered so softly that only I could hear. He said that this was getting dangerous, Iris. He said that people who can't manage their own medication belong in assisted living facilities. He said he had a brochure for a very nice home in the next state, and he was going to show it to Clara tonight. He pulled back and looked at me, his face a mask of worry. He shouted for Clara to hurry up because Mom was looking pale. I sat in the chair, sipping the water Clara held to my lips, and I looked at my son-in-law. He was patting my hand and smoothing my hair. He had orchestrated this entire scene perfectly. He had proven to Clara that I was not only incompetent but also paranoid and aggressive. If I fought him now, I would lose. If I accused him again, I would be sent away. I took a deep breath and swallowed the pill Clara gave me. I looked at Derek and I saw the triumph in his eyes. He thought he had broken me, but he hadn't. He had just taught me the rules of the game. I couldn't be the accuser anymore. I had to be the victim. I had to become exactly what he wanted me to be until he stopped watching me closely. I looked at Clara and forced tears into my eyes. I apologized. I told her I didn't know how the pills got there. I told her I was scared. Derek smiled. It was the smile of a predator who thinks the hunt is over. But he was wrong. The hunt had just begun. I became a ghost in my own life. It was a conscious decision, and it was the hardest role I have ever had to play. After the incident with the medication, I stopped fighting. I stopped asking questions about the finances, and I stopped correcting people when they treated me like a child. Instead, I shuffled when I walked. I let my mouth hang slightly open when I was listening to someone speak, and I stared at walls as if I were watching a movie that only I could see. It was humiliating, but it was effective. In our society, older women are already invisible, but an older woman with cognitive decline is practically a piece of furniture. You stop being a person and you become an obligation. And people say things in front of furniture that they would never say in front of a witness. The transformation took about a week to fully take hold. I spent my days in the sunroom knitting a scarf that had no pattern and no end. I would drop stitches on purpose and ask Clara the same question 3 times in an hour. I asked her when her father was coming home, even though he had been dead for 10 years. It broke Clara's heart to see me like that. She cried in the kitchen when she thought I wasn't listening. It killed me to hurt her, but I knew that the only way to save her future was to sacrifice her present peace of mind. I had to be patient. I had to wait for Derek to get comfortable. And he did. At first, he was suspicious. He would watch me closely when I forgot where the bathroom was. He would test me by asking sharp, sudden questions about the past. But I never slipped up. I gave him the blank, watery stare of a woman whose mind was drifting away like a boat unmoored from the dock. By the second week, his arrogance took over. He stopped whispering when he was in the same room as me. He stopped shielding his phone screen. To him, I was no longer a threat. I was just a nuisance that he had successfully neutralized. One rainy Tuesday, Clara went to the grocery store, leaving me alone in the house with Derek. I was sitting in the high-backed armchair in the living room with a blanket over my knees, staring at the unlit fireplace. Derek walked in, talking on his cell phone. He didn't leave the room. He didn't lower his voice. He walked right past me and poured himself a drink from the crystal decanter on the sideboard. He glanced at me once, saw the vacuous look on my face, and turned his back to me as he continued his conversation. He was talking to his lawyer, or perhaps a fixer. He sounded agitated. He said that the transfer was stuck in the intermediary bank. He said they needed to clear the accounts before the fiscal year ended, which was only 4 days away. I sat perfectly still. I didn't knit. I didn't blink. I focused every ounce of my energy on my hearing. He took a sip of his drink and paced around the room. He said that the rehabilitation center was going to receive a massive donation at the upcoming gala on Saturday. He said he intended to mix the dirty money with the clean donation funds to wash it all in one go. He called it the big rinse. My blood boiled. He was going to use the goodwill of honest donors to hide his theft. The gala was on Saturday night. That was my deadline. I had 4 days to stop him. He ended the call and turned around. He looked at me sitting there in my wool blanket. He walked over to me and stood looming over the chair. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass. He asked me if I was enjoying the view. His voice was mocking. I looked up at him slowly. I decided to give him a little gift, a reinforcement of his victory. I smiled a confused, sweet smile, and I called him Thomas. I asked him if he had fixed the leak in the roof yet, Thomas. Derek laughed. It was a cold, ugly sound. He leaned down and patted my cheek with a patronizing tap. He told me that Thomas was gone and that he was the man of the house now. He told me to just go back to sleep. He walked out of the room whistling. He felt invincible. He thought he was living in a house with a broken old woman. But as soon as his footsteps faded down the hallway, I dropped the act. The blank stare vanished, and my eyes snapped into focus. My mind was racing. I knew the timeline. Saturday night at the gala. I knew the method. Commingling funds. But knowing it wasn't enough. I needed proof that would stand up in court. I needed the second set of books. I knew they were in the safe. I had watched him access it once from the reflection in the patio door, but I hadn't seen the combination clearly. It was a digital keypad. I needed to get into that safe. And I needed to do it while he was in the house, because the alarm system was always armed when he left. I looked at the fireplace. I looked at the heavy brass poker. No, that was too crude. I was a forensic accountant, not a burglar. I needed to use my brain. I looked outside. The storm was getting worse. The wind was whipping the trees against the house. The power lines on the street were swaying dangerously. I remembered that the estate had a backup generator, but it was manual. If the power went out, someone had to go out to the shed in the back 40 to turn it on. That would take at least 10 minutes. 10 minutes was all I needed. I picked up my knitting needles. I wasn't knitting a scarf anymore. I was knitting a plan. The storm arrived on Thursday night, just as the weatherman had predicted. It was a violent affair with thunder that shook the floorboards beneath my feet and wind that howled around the eaves of the old stone house like a pack of wolves trying to get in. Clara was out at her weekly book club meeting, which meant she was safe and dry in a coffee shop in town, leaving me alone in the house with the wolf that was already inside. I was sitting in the living room pretending to read a magazine upside down while Derek paced the hallway. He hated storms because they interfered with his satellite internet, and right now, he was desperate to keep his connection stable for the final transfers before the gala. Every time the lights flickered, he would curse under his breath and glare at the chandelier as if he could intimidate the electricity into staying on. Then it happened. A crack of lightning struck a transformer down the road, followed by an immediate and total darkness. The house went pitch black. I heard Derek let out a string of obscenities that would have made a sailor blush. He fumbled around in the dark, and I heard the beam of a heavy flashlight click on, cutting a sharp yellow swathe through the gloom. He shone the light in my face for a brief second, blinding me. He told me to stay right where I was. He said the generator didn't kick on automatically because the starter was jammed, and he had to go out to the shed to crank it manually. He told me not to move, or I would break a hip. I nodded and pulled my shawl tighter, pretending to be terrified of the dark. He grabbed his raincoat and slammed the back door behind him. I counted to 3. 1, 2, 3. I threw the magazine on the floor and stood up. The old woman act vanished instantly. I moved through the dark house with the confidence of someone who had memorized the floor plan by counting steps during the day. I didn't need a flashlight because the lightning flashes provided a strobe light effect that guided me down the hallway to the study. I had 10 minutes at best. The shed was 200 yards away through mud and rain, but Derek was fast. I entered the study and closed the door. I went straight to the large oil painting of a fox hunt that hung behind his desk. It was a pretentious piece of art for a man who had never ridden a horse. I swung the frame away from the wall, revealing the steel face of a wall safe. I took a deep breath and steadied my hands. I had never actually seen the numbers he typed, but 3 nights ago, I had watched his reflection in the glass of the patio door while I was watering the plants outside. I had watched the position of his hand, top left, bottom right, middle, top right. It was a pattern, not a number. 7, 9, 5, 3. I pressed the keys. The keypad beeped softly with each press. The light turned red. Incorrect. My heart hammered against my ribs. I had misjudged the angle of the reflection. I tried to visualize his hand again. He had reached down first, then up. I tried the reverse. 1, 3, 5, 9. Red light. I could hear the wind howling outside, but beneath it, I strained my ears for the sound of the generator engine starting up. Silence. He was still struggling with it. I had one more try before the keypad would lock me out for 5 minutes, which would be a death sentence. I closed my eyes and put myself back in the garden. I watched his hand again in my memory. It wasn't a corner-to-corner pattern. It was a date. He was a narcissist. It wouldn't be Clara's birthday. It wouldn't be their anniversary. It would be his own birthday or the day he took over the charity. I remembered the day he was appointed director. October 15th, 1, 0, 1, 5. I typed it in. The light turned green. The heavy click of the solenoid releasing was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I pulled the heavy door open. Inside, there were stacks of cash held together with rubber bands and a velvet box containing the platinum watch I had seen on the receipt. But I ignored those. I reached to the back and pulled out a slim black notebook and a small silver flash drive. I opened the notebook. It was handwritten. It listed dates and amounts, and next to each entry were initials. CI for Cayman Islands, Vegas for gambling debts. It was a diary of his crimes written in his own hand. I shoved the notebook and the drive down the front of my blouse, tucking them securely into my waistband. I closed the safe and swung the painting back into place just as a low rumble started in the distance. The generator. I ran. I didn't shuffle, I ran. I made it back to the living room just as the overhead lights flickered and buzzed back to life. I threw myself into the armchair and grabbed the magazine, holding it upside down again. The back door opened. Derek came in, shaking the rain off his coat. He looked wet and miserable and angry. He walked into the living room and looked at me. I looked up at him and blinked. I asked him why the lights were blinking. I asked him if the storm was over. He stared at me for a long, suspicious moment. He looked at my chest, which was heaving slightly from the exertion. He asked me why I was out of breath. I told him the thunder scared me. I told him I thought the house was falling down. He rolled his eyes and turned away, muttering about how useless I was. He went to the kitchen to get a towel. I let out a breath that I felt like I had been holding for 40 years. I had the ledger, but now I had a bigger problem. I had the evidence on my body, but I was trapped in a house with a man who would kill me if he knew I had it. I needed to get the information out, and the Wi-Fi was still down. The walk from the main house back to my guest cottage felt like the longest journey of my life. The rain was still coming down in sheets, and the wind whipped my wet clothes against my skin. But I did not feel the cold. All I could feel was the hard, rectangular outline of the ledger pressed against my stomach, hidden beneath my layers of wool and deception. I held my arms crossed over my chest, hugging myself as if I were just a frail old woman trying to keep warm, but in reality, I was guarding the only thing that could save me. I fumbled with the keys at my door, my hands shaking so badly that I dropped them into a puddle. I fell to my knees in the mud, groping frantically until my fingers closed around the cold metal. I scrambled inside and slammed the door behind me, locking the deadbolt and sliding the chain into place. I did not turn on the lights. I could not risk Derek looking out his window and seeing me moving around with a purpose that did not match my senile persona. I crawled into the bathroom, which had no windows, and locked that door too. I turned on the small vanity light and pulled the notebook and the flash drive from my waistband. My hands were covered in mud and trembling, but my mind was surgical. I opened the notebook. It was worse than I thought. It wasn't just gambling debts. There were payments to local zoning officials and bribes to inspectors. Derek wasn't just a thief, he was a cancer, rotting the entire foundation of the charity from the inside out. I pulled out my burner phone from its hiding place under the floorboards. I had 17% battery left. I opened the camera app and started snapping photos of the pages. I worked fast. Click, turn page, click, turn page. The focus had to be perfect. If the numbers were blurry, they were useless. I photographed 30 pages of the most damning entries. Then I took a picture of the flash drive next to the notebook to prove they existed. I opened the email app. I typed in Arthur's secure address. In the subject line, I wrote just one word: evidence. I attached the photos. The file size was huge. I hit send. The progress bar appeared on the screen. It moved an inch and then it stopped. I stared at the blue line. It was stuck at 10%. I held the phone up toward the ceiling, praying for a signal. The storm was wreaking havoc on the cell towers. The little bars in the corner of the screen flickered from 1 to 0 and back to 1. The progress bar didn't move. I felt a wave of panic rise up in my throat. I had the smoking gun, but I couldn't fire it. If I couldn't get this email out tonight, I would have to carry the physical book with me, and Derek was already watching me like a hawk. If he found this book on me, I would never leave this estate alive. Suddenly, I heard a sound that made my blood freeze. Someone was trying the handle of the cottage front door. The handle rattled violently. Then a heavy fist pounded on the wood. Iris opened the door. It was Derek. His voice wasn't smooth anymore. It was tight and aggressive. I scrambled to turn off the bathroom light. I grabbed the notebook and shoved it into the dirty laundry hamper, burying it under a pile of used towels. I shoved the phone into the pocket of my robe. I flushed the toilet to create a noise of normalcy and unlocked the bathroom door. I walked into the dark living room and approached the front door. I asked, "Who is it?" My voice sounded thin and terrified, which wasn't hard to fake. He yelled that it was Derek and to open the damn door. I undid the chain and opened the door a crack. He pushed it open, forcing me to step back. He stood there, framed by the storm, dripping wet and looking furious. He marched past me and looked around the room. He asked me why I had the chain on. He said he had been calling the cottage landline for 10 minutes and I didn't answer. I told him I was in the bathroom. I told him I didn't hear the phone because of the thunder. He looked at me with eyes that were cold and dead. He stepped closer, forcing me to back up until my legs hit the sofa. He asked me if I had been in his study. My heart stopped. He knew. He must have checked the safe. I looked at him and let my lower lip tremble. I told him I didn't know where his study was. I asked him if that was the room with the television. He stared at me, searching for a lie. The silence stretched out for 10 seconds. He was weighing the options. He was trying to decide if I was a master manipulator or just a confused old bat. Finally, he exhaled a sharp breath of frustration. He ran a hand through his wet hair. He said that someone had moved the painting in his office. It was crooked. I blinked. I told him maybe it was the earthquake. He looked at me like I was an idiot. He said there was no earthquake, Iris, it was a thunderstorm. He turned around and walked to the door. Before he left, he turned back to me. He pointed a finger at my face. He said, "Do not leave this cottage." He said the storm is dangerous and he doesn't want me wandering around getting hurt. He said he would lock the gate from the outside just to be safe. He slammed the door and I heard the heavy click of a key turning in the lock from the outside. I was a prisoner. I rushed back to the bathroom and pulled the phone out of my pocket. The screen was dark. The battery had died. I stared at the black mirror of the phone. The email hadn't sent. The evidence was still in the laundry hamper. And I was locked in a cottage with a man who knew someone had touched his safe. I had to survive until the gala. I had to get this book out of here. And since I couldn't send it digitally, I was going to have to walk it out the front door, right under his nose. Friday passed in a blur of forced confinement and mounting dread. I spent the entire day locked in the cottage, listening to the rain tap against the roof like a countdown clock. I had charged my phone using the outlet behind the dresser, but there was no signal. The storm had knocked out the local tower completely. The email was still sitting in my outbox, a digital ghost haunting my device. Saturday morning arrived with a clear sky and a terrible clarity of purpose. Today was the gala. Tonight, Derek would execute his big rinse, and if I didn't stop him, the money and my credibility would be gone forever. At noon, Elena came to unlock the cottage door. She was carrying a garment bag. She told me that Mr. Mercer insisted I attend the gala. He wanted the whole family there for the photos. It was a power move. He wanted to parade his senile mother-in-law in front of the donors to show how benevolent he was. He was using me as a prop. Perfect. That was exactly where I needed to be. I took the garment bag. Inside was a navy blue silk dress that was tasteful but old-fashioned. I dressed slowly. I put on my support hose and my sensible shoes. Then I went to the laundry hamper. I pulled out the black notebook. It was too thick to hide in my purse. The clutch bag I was supposed to carry was tiny, barely big enough for a lipstick and a tissue. I couldn't tape it to my body. The silk dress would show every lump and bump. I looked around the room desperately. My eyes landed on my medical supplies. I wore a back brace occasionally for my lumbar stenosis. It was a rigid, bulky corset made of canvas and steel stays. I put the brace on over my camisole. I slid the thin notebook between the brace and the small of my back. It was uncomfortable. The sharp edges dug into my spine, but the stiff fabric of the brace concealed the outline perfectly. I put the dress on over it. I looked in the mirror. I looked a little stiffer than usual, a little more upright, but otherwise normal. I put the flash drive in my bra. At 5 o'clock, the limousine pulled up. Derek and Clara were waiting. Derek looked like a movie star in his tuxedo. Clara looked beautiful but tired, her eyes red-rimmed, as if she had been crying. Derek helped me into the car. He patted my back right where the notebook was hidden. I flinched. He asked me if I was in pain. I told him my back was acting up again. I told him I had to wear my brace. He smiled and said that was good. He said I should sit up straight for the cameras. The ride to the hotel ballroom was silent. I stared out the window, watching the city lights blur by. I was terrified, not of getting caught, but of failing. If I couldn't get to the microphone, or if I couldn't get anyone to listen, all of this pain would be for nothing. We arrived at the venue. It was glittering with chandeliers and overflowing with expensive flowers. There were photographers everywhere. Derek held Clara's hand with one hand and guided me with the other, his grip firm on my elbow. We walked the red carpet. Flashes popped, blinding me. Inside, the room was filled with the city's elite. Waiters circulated with champagne. I declined. I needed a clear head. I saw the head of the police department shaking hands with the mayor. I saw the bank manager. All the players were here. We were seated at the head table on a raised platform. I was placed at the far end next to a potted palm tree safely away from the microphone. Derek sat in the center. Dinner was served. I pushed the rubbery chicken around my plate. I watched Derek work the room. He was charming, laughing, touching people on the shoulder. He was so good at this. It made me sick. At 8 o'clock, the lights dimmed. A spotlight hit the podium. The Master of Ceremonies announced that it was time for the keynote address from the Humanitarian of the Year, Mr. Derek Mercer. The room erupted in applause. Derek stood up. He kissed Clara's cheek. He walked to the podium, basking in the adoration. He started his speech. He talked about sacrifice. He talked about honor. He talked about how we owe everything to our veterans. I looked at my phone under the table. Still no signal in the ballroom. The email was dead. I looked at the police chief. He was nodding along to Derek's words. I realized then that sending an email wasn't enough. Handing over a book quietly wasn't enough. Derek could talk his way out of an investigation. He could claim the book was forged. He could claim I was crazy. I had to do something he couldn't talk his way out of. I had to destroy him publicly. I had to break the spell. I reached behind my back. I unzipped the dress slightly. I reached down into the brace. My fingers grazed the leather cover of the notebook. Derek was building to his crescendo. He raised his glass. He said he was proud to announce a new initiative that would change lives. I stood up. My chair scraped loudly against the wooden floor. Heads turned. Clara whispered, "Mom, sit down." I ignored her. I walked behind the chairs. I didn't shuffle. I marched. Derek saw me coming. He faltered for a second, but then he smiled. He spoke into the microphone. He said, "Looks like my mother-in-law wants to say a few words." He chuckled, inviting the audience to laugh at the confused old woman. I walked up the stairs to the podium. Derek stepped back, offering me the mic with a condescending bow. He thought I was going to ramble. He thought I was going to embarrass myself. I took the microphone. I looked out at the sea of faces. I looked at the police chief. Then I pulled the black notebook out from behind my back and slammed it onto the podium. The sound echoed through the silent room like a gunshot. I looked directly at Derek. I said, "I think you forgot this in the safe, Thomas." The smile fell off his face like it had been slapped away. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that usually precedes a disaster. 1,000 eyes were fixed on the podium where a small black notebook sat like a judgment block between me and the man who had tried to erase my existence. Derek recovered first. His survival instinct kicked in, and he reached for the microphone, his hand forcing a smile that looked more like a rictus of pain. He laughed a nervous, bubbling sound that echoed horribly over the speakers. He told the crowd that he was so sorry. He said that his mother-in-law was having one of her spells. He reached out to grab my arm, his fingers digging into my bicep with bruising force. He whispered through his teeth for me to get off the stage before he threw me off. I looked at his hand on my arm. Then I looked at his eyes. I pulled my arm away with a sharp, violent jerk that startled him enough to make him step back. I leaned into the microphone. I spoke clearly, and my voice did not waver. I dropped the tremulous whisper of the confused old woman and replaced it with the steel tone of the forensic auditor I had been for 30 years. I said, "I am not having a spell, Derek. I am having a moment of clarity, and I think everyone in this room deserves one too." A ripple of shock went through the crowd. They heard the change in my voice. They saw the change in my posture. I wasn't hunched over anymore. I was standing 5 feet 4 inches of pure accusation. Derek lunged for the mic again, but I pivoted, shielding it with my body. I opened the notebook to a page I had bookmarked with a folded corner. I looked directly at the front table. I said, "Chief Miller, I believe you are sitting in the front row. If you would be so kind as to look at page 42 of this ledger, you will find a record of a cash payment of $15,000 made to a building inspector on August 4th. That was the day the safety violations at the new rehab wing mysteriously disappeared." Chief Miller stood up. His face was unreadable, but he wasn't looking at me. He was looking at Derek. Derek's face drained of color. He started shouting over me, saying that this was insane, saying that I was writing fiction in a diary. He yelled for security to remove me. I turned the page. I said, "Mr. Henderson, you are the branch manager of First National. On page 60, you will find the transaction codes for the wire transfers that moved donor funds into a shell company called Blue Horizon Holdings. You might want to check who the signatory is on that account." I looked at Derek. I said, "It is you, Derek. It has always been you." The room erupted into chaos. People were standing up. Chairs were scraping. The illusion of the benevolent philanthropist was shattering in real time. Derek looked at the crowd, and then he looked at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. He realized he couldn't talk his way out of this. He had lost the audience. He made a decision. He abandoned the podium and jumped down the stairs. He wasn't running toward Clara. He was running toward the exit, but he didn't make it. Chief Miller stepped into the aisle and blocked his path. 2 uniformed officers who had been standing at the perimeter of the room moved in. Derek tried to shove past the chief. He screamed that he was being set up. He screamed that I was a senile old witch who didn't know what she was talking about. But then, a voice cut through the noise. It was a voice shaking with tears and betrayal. It was Clara. She was standing at the head table holding her phone. She looked at Derek, and then she looked at me. She said she just got an email. I looked down at my dress. The phone in my pocket buzzed against my hip. The signal in the ballroom had finally connected. The email I had tried to send 2 nights ago had just pushed through. Clara held up her phone. She said Mom sent me photos of the ledger and photos of the bank statements. She looked at her husband. She asked him how he could do this. She asked him how he could steal from them. Derek looked at Clara, and for the first time, I saw the fight leave him. He wasn't looking at a wife anymore. He was looking at a witness. The officers grabbed his arms. He didn't resist. He slumped forward, deflated and small. As they led him away, he looked back over his shoulder at the stage. He looked at me. I stood alone at the podium, the spotlight still blindingly bright in my eyes. I closed the black notebook. My hands started to shake again, but this time it wasn't an act. It was the adrenaline leaving my body. I looked out at the room of stunned, silent faces. I leaned into the microphone one last time. I said, I apologize for ruining the evening, but I believe the truth is the only donation that really matters. I stepped away from the podium and walked down the stairs. My knees felt weak, but I didn't fall. Clara ran to me. She threw her arms around my neck and sobbed into my shoulder. I held her tight. The metal stays of my back brace dug into my skin, but I didn't care. The weight was gone. The flashing blue lights of the police cruisers painted the front of the hotel in a chaotic rhythm of light and shadow. I stood by the revolving doors, watching as they put Derek into the back of a squad car. He looked small and ordinary, without his expensive suit jacket, which they had removed to handcuff him. He didn't look back at us. He stared straight ahead at the mesh divider, already trying to figure out his next move, but I knew there were no moves left for him. The evidence in that black notebook was a cage he could not escape. Clara drove us home that night. We took my old sedan, which had been sitting in the garage gathering dust for months. The luxury SUV was parked at the hotel, impounded as evidence of assets purchased with stolen funds. The silence in the car was different this time. It wasn't heavy with secrets, it was heavy with grief. When we pulled into the driveway, Clara turned off the engine, but she didn't open the door. She gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. She turned to me, and the street lamp cast a soft light on her tear-stained face. She asked me if I could ever forgive her. She said she felt so stupid. She said he made her believe that I was fading away, and she mourned me while I was still standing right in front of her. I reached over and covered her hand with mine. I told her that she had nothing to apologize for. I told her that Derek was a professional liar who had fooled banks and boards of directors, so it was no shame that he had fooled a wife who loved him. I told her that the only thing that mattered was that we were safe and the cancer had been cut out of our lives. We went inside, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel like a guest in a stranger's house. I made us tea, and we sat in the kitchen until the sun came up, talking about everything we had missed while I was playing the part of the ghost. It has been 6 months since that night. The legal process was swift and brutal. With the notebook and the flash drive, the district attorney had everything he needed. Derek pleaded guilty to 12 counts of wire fraud and embezzlement in exchange for a lighter sentence, but he will still be in prison until he is an old man. The charity took a hit to its reputation, but it survived. The board of directors asked me to step in as the interim director to clean up the mess. They needed someone who knew the numbers and someone the public could trust. I accepted. I spent the first 3 months auditing every single penny. I sold the luxury cars. I fired the overpaid consultants. I brought the focus back to where it belonged, which was helping the veterans. Yesterday, I hired a new permanent director. She is a young woman, a former Army medic with a sharp mind and a good heart. I am staying on as the treasurer because I don't think I am quite ready to retire again just yet. I still live in the guest cottage, but not because I have to. Clara asked me to move into the main house, But I like my little space. It is cozy, and it is mine. We sold the big estate last week. It was too big and too full of bad memories. We are looking for a smaller place closer to town, something with a garden that Clara can tend to without looking over her shoulder. I am sitting on the porch now, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of purple and gold. The air is cool and smells of rain, but I am not cold. My back brace is in the closet gathering dust next to the knitting needles I never learned how to use properly. I take a sip of my tea and think about the woman I had to become to save my family. I played the role of the frail, invisible old woman because that is what the world expected to see. Derek looked at me and saw a liability. He saw a crumbling relic. He never bothered to look deeper. It is a mistake that people often make with women of a certain age. They think that because we move slower, we are not moving forward. They think that because we are quiet, we have nothing to say. They forget that we have lived through things they cannot even imagine. They forget that silver hair is not a sign of surrender. It is a sign of survival. I put my cup down and smile. I am Iris Blackwood. I am 74 years old. I am a mother and a grandmother and a forensic accountant, and I am finally wide awake. So that is my story. I would love to hear what you think. Is it ever right to lie to the ones you love, if it is the only way to save them from a truth that could destroy them? Let me know in the comments below. And if you believe in justice, please subscribe to Silver Fox Legacy. Until next time.